I'd like to see him as vice chairman of the party, actually in charge of campaigning, particularly in the Red Wall. But I think it will need a new team. It will need a new leader, new policies, and a new team that appeals to Boris for him to do that. And if we do that, then we could be in business. It could be a lot closer.
First up, as I mentioned, and has been featured on the news all morning, Boris Johnson is back. Well, I mean, sort of. He's expected to return to the Conservative fold to campaign in the Red Wall at the general election. The aim is to retain the votes of those who backed him in 2019, when he won an 80-seat majority, based in large part on seats won in the north of England and the Midlands. Graham Stewart, the Energy Minister, told Times Radio that Boris Johnson's comeback was a sign of the Conservative Party uniting.
As I say, what it is about the Conservative family coming together and working flat out together to close that opinion poll lead that Labour currently enjoy. Because every day we look at what a Labour government would consist of, we can see how weak and damaging it would be.
So, is this the reunification of a broad church or a sign of desperation? In a moment, I'll be speaking to Lara Spirit, Times Red Box editor. But first, let's speak to David Campbell Bannerman, chairman of the Conservative Democracy Organisation and former Tory MEP. Welcome to the programme, David. What's in it for Boris?
Well, first of all, Boris is a loyal Conservative. I'm sure he would like to help. But actually, the story is a bit strange because no one has called Boris. We know people close to him. And Rishi hasn't picked up the phone in a year, they reckon. So it's a bit of a mystery. But he would be a great asset if we could have Boris back helping the campaign, particularly in the Red Wall seats, as we saw Lee Anderson, unfortunately, defecting yesterday. That's a very key area, and Boris was responsible for getting many of those seats.
But don't you think that it's Tory policies that will be putting off the voters in those seats rather than personalities as such?
Well, I personally, I think we need a change at the top, I'm afraid. I think we need to replace Sunak with someone that's recognisably Conservative with the right kind of policies. Because what's happening in the Conservative Party, it's not really a swing to Labour. There were 6 by-elections where 20,000 Conservative voters went missing. They're basically on strike, our voters. And the question is, how do we get those people back in time? I think Boris is part of the equation, part of a package. But I'm afraid I think it needs new leadership and it needs a return to traditional Conservative policies. And then it will be much closer. It would be transformative.
But I presume you're not suggesting the return of Boris as Prime Minister, or at least as leader of the Conservative Party. I mean, Partygate, proroguing Parliament in 2019, scandals which resulted in a mass revolt by ministers over his leadership, the amount of people who were, completely revolted by what was happening in Downing Street at the same time as they were respecting COVID rules. I mean, it's hard to imagine how he's going to lure voters. I mean, does it suggest a degree of desperation around the Tory party at the moment?
Well, Boris still is very popular in many parts. He was never universally popular. That's true. And Partygate did put off a number of people. But the point is, Boris is a great asset. He still is a great campaigner. I think, I'm not suggesting he will come back as leader. No, I think he's not even MP, of course, at the moment. But he could be part of a team. I'd like to see him as vice chairman of the party, actually in charge of campaigning, particularly in the Red Wall. But I think it will need a new team. It will need a new leader, new policies, and a new team that appeals to Boris for him to do that. And if we do that, then we could be in business. It could be a lot closer.
My goodness. Thank you very much indeed. David Campbell Bannerman, chairman of the Conservative Democracy Organisation and former Tory MEP. Let me now turn to Lara Spirit, Times Red Box editor. Well, let's bring back Boris, shall we, Lara? I mean, are you taken by surprise by this? I do sometimes feel like I am on a hamster wheel.
I think for those of us who watched the fallout between Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak last year, it wasn't the first of those kind of fallouts, but it was certainly the biggest over Boris Johnson's resignation honours. You'll remember that, Boris Johnson accused Rishi Sunak of reneging on an agreement they'd made over his honours. Rishi Sunak then saying that no agreement of that sort had ever existed. I think to then see this thawing of relations so soon, so kind of months before an election, not even in the campaign, is quite surprising for those of us who watch Westminster closely because of the acrimony that we've previously seen between those two individuals.
And do you think it suggests that there's been a reconciliation between the two? I mean, at the moment, perhaps unfairly, the look of what Rishi Sunak is doing seems to be grasping in almost every direction in the hope of something solid to hang on to.
I mean, I think there's 2 points. The first point there is the strategic point, which is, are they pivoting again towards the red wall, having had a budget which many of us thought wasn't necessarily red wall focused in its priorities, and after, you know, a number of recent events that some Conservative MPs have said signals the kind of end of a focus on a red wall, especially Tory MPs I speak to from the One Nation wing, some of them in southern heartlands. They say even our seats are under risk. The red wall is gone. We need to focus on our seats now. The second point is, I think, a personality point, which is to say that Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak, very clear from the reporting today, are not going to be sharing a podium anytime soon, and sources close to them say that. This isn't about the two of them getting back together and standing side by side. They're not kind of unified, but it's certainly about saying, you know, Boris Johnson is a real asset to the Conservative Party in their view, and he should be deployed strategically towards the red wall where it's understood he has more of an appeal.
David Campbell Bannerman mentioned there that Boris Johnson's not an MP. Of course, that didn't stand in the way of David Cameron returning to government. Is there a possibility that we're going to see a Lord Johnson and a Lord Cameron post an election defeat, which isn't, you know, beyond the realms of possibility by any manner of means, battling it out to lead the Conservative Party and become Prime Minister again?
Well, I think you'd need to end up in a kind of Alec Douglas-Hume situation where they would then need to be seeking a parliamentary seat. I don't think that either of them, you know, would misunderstand the rules in that way. But I do think that, and nor do I think actually that Rishi Sunak would be that keen on ennobling Boris Johnson. There have been a number of theories, especially over the last couple of days, about the ways that you could get Boris Johnson back into frontline politics. One in the Daily Mail over the weekend regarding whether or not you could parachute him into that safe Henley seat and get the candidate there who's known to be an ally of his to stand down. The view there was, could you get him to come in and remove Rishi Sunak and then he'd be Prime Minister? I think, you know, there are quite a lot of these theories, I think, which speaks to the level of support that there is from some still for Boris Johnson. But I think, you know, what we've seen this morning about him playing a limited but strategic role, significant though it is, given the points I've just mentioned, probably seems closer to the mark.
Again, my previous guest, David Campbell Bannerman, talked about, you know, the need to return to traditional Tory values. And I just wonder if they're becoming harder to identify in a party that seems to be formed of so many sort of opposing factions, if you will. I mean, highlighted, I suppose, by first the presence and now the absence of someone like Lee Anderson, but now with Boris Johnson coming back, with David Cameron providing probably the biggest political surprise of the last year when he marched down Downing Street that day. You know, just where is the Tory party currently?
Well, that's a very huge question, and I think
Sorry, Lara.
No, and it's a fascinating one, of course, and it speaks to, I think, the level of confusion that a number of MPs themselves have about the strategy going into this election campaign. As I said, is it one where they are looking to imbibe some of the lessons from 2019, thinking whether they are still relevant? Of course, that was a totemic campaign in part because of Brexit, and nobody is pretending that that is going to be top of voters' priorities in this election. And I think that does speak to the differences that this election will have. And I think it's interesting in light of this question about the role that Boris Johnson now plays. But I do think the rhetoric that we heard from Boris Johnson, specifically around public services in 2019, that was more red wall focused, is something that a number of MPs are urging Rishi Sunak to emulate as much as he possibly can. But there's certainly this big question, I think, that it comes down to, which is, are you, looking at the polls as they currently are, the most recent YouGov MRP, 169 Tory seats only, are you, in circumstances like that, going to focus your resources on campaigning in all of those, including the 80-seat majority that Boris Johnson won in 2019? Or are you going to be more strategic and say, even some of our notionally safer seats are under risk now, and we're going to focus resources there? And the Boris Johnson announcement seems to suggest that there will be some focus on the Red Wall still. And then you've got David Cameron, probably Lord Cameron, who will be aiming to kind of, go to those strategy, which is, I think, why your question is an interesting one.
Well, thank you very much. I'm taking that as a compliment. Lara Spirit, Times Red Box editor, thanks again for trying to provide some clarity on what is a difficult to unpick topic, the return of Boris Johnson et al.